Now we're going to talk about the female reproductive system. As you can imagine, this is a little bit more complex than the males because we don't just transfer something over. We actually house the baby for 9 months. We give birth to the baby, and then once the baby is born, we feed them. So this is the female reproductive system. We have two... I really miss having my pen. We have two ovaries that are lateral. So you've got one on the right and one on the left. This is just a mid-sagittal cut. So imagine a dotted line going down the center of your nose. You can see one ovary in this picture over here. So we've got the two ovaries. We also have two uterine tubes, which are these tubes here. And you can see one here. They can also be called the fallopian tubes. They can also be called the oviducts. Don't forget that ducts just means tubes. So oviducts, it's coming from the ovary over. Next, we've got the uterus. We have one midline uterus, which you can see here in the mid-sagittal view, and this kind of upside down looking pear shape here in the frontal view. Now, the vaginal canal. The vaginal canal is the copulatory organ for the female. This is where the penis actually enters the female's body. So it's here in the mid-sagittal picture. This is it here. We have one of those. We don't have two. The external organs include things like the labia minora and the labia majora, which you cannot see in the bottom picture. And we've got the mammary glands as well, which you don't see in either of these pictures. Ligaments are responsible for basically holding everything in place. Just like pretty much everything else, we've got connective tissue to kind of have everything suspended where we need it to be. So the ovaries, again, these are the ovaries, okay? They're about the size of an almond. And contrary to what this picture shows, truly the ovary is here. Those fallopian tubes are like over here. They don't actually enclose it like what you see in this picture, and that's always bugged me about these figures, because there's just as much chance of an oocyte going from your ovary here into the fallopian tube as there is of it falling and just going into your abdominal cavity. So just so you're aware, it's not that held on to with those finger looking things. So your ovary, you've got the germinal epithelium. This is basically a surface covered by simple cuboidal epithelium of the visceral peritoneum. And just like what we saw in the testy, you do have a tunica albuginea. You do have the covering, that connective tissue covering of the ovary. So you can see the ovarian epithelium, these kind of cuboidal cells that you see here, and then that tunica albuginea is actually right inside of that, which you can see here, okay? It's right below that epithelium, and again, it's that same dense fibrous connective tissue that we saw. We have two regions to our ovary. We've got a cortex and we've got a medulla. Same as always. Medulla means middle, cortex means the outside. There's a stroma and a parenchyma. So remember, stroma and parenchyma always mean the same thing. Stroma is the framework. So that's the connective tissue that you have inside the ovary. If you look kind of dead center here, you can see that there are blood vessels, lymphatic vessels, even nerves that enter into that medulla, into that center core of your ovary. You do have numerous small vesicles that are distributed throughout the stroma. If we were going to name anything as the parenchyma, the functional portion, it would be these vesicles, okay? These ovarian vesicles. They actually are known as the ovarian follicles, and each one contains an oocyte. Each one contains a possible baby. So if you look, see these little cells that are all over the place here? These are going to be your ovarian follicles. And you can see kind of the progress of one as it matures here and becomes a Graafian follicle, a really big follicle. But for the most part, we've got these kind of all over the place. It's just that only certain ones are chosen to actually mature into something that can be fertilized. So, the primordial follicle. It is the primary oocyte. It's surrounded by a single layer of flat cells called granulosa cells, which you can see here. They're squamous cells, so they just look flat like pancakes that surround that cell. At the beginning of puberty, some of these primordial follicles will actually be converted into what we call primary follicles. Now, the primary follicles, you can see going from that up there, hang on, from this up here to this down here, okay, that oocyte has actually enlarged, and those granulosa cells that were around it have actually become more cuboidal in shape. They're not that flat pancake shape anymore that you can see up on that first cell. They're actually fairly robust. They're thicker. Let's see. Several layers of granulosa cells will start to form, and a layer of clear material is also deposited around that primary oocyte called the zona pellucida. So again, as this continues to mature, you can see that now I've got several layers of those cells, and around that oocyte, there's kind of this fluid-filled space that is called the zona pellucida, okay? Every 28 days, hormonal changes in the female body stimulate some of these primary here to actually convert into the secondary here, number 4, okay? And as those vesicles start to develop within the granulosa cells, you can see that there are little fluid-filled cavities in here. They actually expand. I'm getting more granulosa cells. I'm kind of getting a fluid-filled space that isn't the zona pellucida. And even externally, you can see that I've got kind of this outer membrane starting to form. I've got one called the theca interna and then the theca externa. The theca externa kind of looks like fuzz. You can see it better here. It's kind of that kind of outer fuzzy membrane. And then the theca interna is the one with those kind of pink cells that you can see inside of that. So the theca itself is actually a capsule that forms around that follicle. It kind of encloses it in its own space. By the time that we get to okay, I'm getting ahead of myself again. The theca interna surrounds the granulosa cells and actually aids those same granulosa cells in the formation of the ovarian hormones. Literally, your ovary makes certain hormones, so it's helpful in that way. The theca externa, really and truly, it's just primarily connective tissue that kind of anchors it into the framework of the ovary. It doesn't really have a primary function other than just it anchors it in place. Now, the secondary follicle will continue to enlarge, okay? That space that's filling with fluid will actually basically become just one big space, and all of those little areas that you see here just kind of fuse together to make one big fluid-filled space that we call the antrum, okay? At this point, this is a mature Graafian follicle. In the mature Graafian follicle, instead of kind of being dead center like what you see here and kind of to the side here, that oocyte is now completely pushed off to one side. And it's buried in this mass of cells here called the cumulus mass. Okay? The innermost cells around the oocyte, I'm going to change colors. These cells right here around this oocyte, this is what we are going to call the corona radiata. Basically, think about drawing a sun when you're a kid and you have little radiating rays all around that sun, that happy sun that you used to draw in yellow. Well, those cells that are right next to the secondary oocyte are going to be what we call the corona radiata. And you'll see that when it gets released, they go with it. So during ovulation, the secondary oocyte is released. See how I've got that mass of cells around my oocyte, my secondary oocyte? So these cells are the corona radiata. I still have that fluid-filled area right next to it that is going to be my zona pellucida, but my secondary oocyte is this little cell that's dead center in the middle. So when ovulation happens, there's kind of a rupture at the side of the ovary, and all of the cells that made up the pocket that this was sitting in will now actually start to divide very, very rapidly. Okay? So they start to just divide and divide and divide and divide, and they become something called the corpus luteum. Now, corpus luteum is responsible, at least initially, for secreting estrogen and progesterone. Okay? Estrogen and progesterone are basically hormones that need to be at relatively high levels to keep the lining of the uterus intact. So this starts multiplying and multiplying and multiplying and getting bigger and bigger and bigger, basically massively producing progesterone and estrogen, and it will stay functional if you get pregnant. Okay? Basically maintaining the lining of your uterus so that your baby has a nice little happy home to stay in. However, it only stays functional for 10 to 12 days, unless pregnancy actually happens, and then it'll become the corpus luteum of pregnancy. If not, it kind of shrivels up into a raisin that we call the corpus albicans. Now, the corpus albicans shrinks. It will eventually disappear, but it's not like it immediately disappears. It can take months for this thing to actually completely dissolve away or degenerate away. But again, this only happens if you don't get pregnant. So, before I forget, in regard to the oocyte and even the sperm, because this is something that I didn't mention that I should have mentioned, they undergo a process called meiosis. Meiosis. Okay? Where they take all of your genetic material and they basically cut it in half. So dad gives you half his genetic material through his sperm, and mom gives you half her genetic material through her egg, and they combine together to make basically a whole set of genes. For humans, we have 23 pairs. 23 come from mom and 23 come from dad. So when you're making sperm, you go through the process of meiosis and you actually get 4 viable sperm. When you go through oogenesis, which is what this is, making oocytes, you only actually come up with 1. The other 2 that come off of the divisions actually kind of die, because remember what I said about the sperm. The sperm is a nucleus with a propeller and a motor, and that's it, right? That means my endoplasmic reticulum, my ribosomes, my mitochondria, my lysosomes, my peroxisomes, all of the other stuff that a cell has to come from the oocyte. So when the oocytes divide during that meiosis step, one is stingy and takes almost everything, and the other, which is called a polar body, is actually left with kind of the nucleus and a little bit of cytoplasm. So it kind of dies away. But the reason that I do that is because the sperm isn't coming with anything else, and I still have to have all of the other organelles in the cell for it to actually be a cell that can function. So, the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, also known as the oviducts. Again, 3 different names for the exact same thing. This is not something that, it's just the same thing. It's this thing right here. Okay? The mucosa, the lining of the uterine tubes, actually provides nutrients for the oocyte, or if it actually has been fertilized, because when an egg gets fertilized, it gets fertilized up here. It does not get fertilized in the uterus. By that point, it's too late, and it'll just basically come out with the menstrual cycle. So it provides for either the oocyte that hasn't been fertilized, or if fertilization has occurred, it basically provides for the developing embryonic mass as it kind of bebops its way down until it can get into the uterus over here. So once it's fertilized, it basically travels to get to the uterus, but by that point it's already dividing and it's starting to make more cells, and it's actually becoming a mass of cells that can become a human. So it's also filled with ciliated cells. So remember, ciliated cells, we talked about this with the respiratory system. They do that crowd surfing thing where it'll actually kind of carry the egg down, or the fertilized egg down into the uterus. Okay? Sorry, guys. I miss my pen. Okay. So, it basically helps to move both either the oocyte or the embryonic mass through and down into that uterus. Now, for women who smoke, it actually kills ciliated cells. So women who smoke are more likely to have issues with things called ectopic pregnancies, where instead of implanting in the uterus where it's supposed to, a baby will implant in the fallopian tube. And unfortunately, with an ectopic pregnancy, there's nothing you can do. Surgically, you have to get it removed, and there's no way to actually save that fetus because there's no way to get it to implant in a different place. Okay, so the uterus. The uterus is this upside down pear-shaped thing right here. It consists of the top here, which is called the fundus, the body, and then the end here that actually opens into the vaginal canal is called the cervix. Cervical mucus glands normally keep things out of the uterus, basically making it really hard for things to move in the opposite direction. The exception is during ovulation, when things are coming from the ovary into the uterus. The spaces formed by the uterus, including the uterine cavity and the cervical canal. So if you look, there's a hollow space. There's a hollow space in the middle of this uterus, right? That's the uterine cavity. That's what that is. Now, there's kind of this little path that's made here through the cervix. If you're going to come in through the vaginal canal, there's that little kind of pathway. That's going to be the cervical canal. Now, looking at the walls of the uterus. You basically have 3 layers. You've got the perineum, which is basically the connective tissue that holds your uterus in place. It's a serous membrane, just like all of our organs are surrounded by membranes. But then the middle of this is called the myometrium. Myo means muscle. This is the smooth muscle that basically surrounds your entire uterus. And when you go into labor, this is the same muscle that contracts to help you to have the baby, to push the baby out. Internally, in here, you can see kind of this darker pink shade, like there. Okay, this is actually the endometrium. Endo means inside. It is a mucous membrane, just like what we have in most of our internal organs, actually, when we've got a tube. But it has two layers to it. It has the basal layer and it has the functional layer. The basal layer is the layer that is closest to my myometrium. So it's the deeper layer that's like right next to this here. The functional layer, however, is the one that is actually right next to that chamber or uterine cavity that I was talking about in this previous slide. This is the layer that actually grows and sloughs off and grows and sloughs off during the menstrual cycle. The basal layer stays, but the functional layer is the one that changes over the 27-28 days. The vagina, which is down here. This is the female organ of copulation. It actually has 3 functions. Okay? 1, like I said, it's the female organ of copulation, meaning that it receives the penis during intercourse. 2, it allows menstrual flow. So when your lining sloughs off and you have your period, this is the exit point. And finally, it's the birth canal. This is what allows a baby out of the human body. It consists of a layer of smooth muscle and an inner lining of moist stratified squamous epithelium. The smooth muscle allows it to stretch during intercourse and childbirth. This is one of the reasons why we can have a child, because that smooth muscle is elastic. As well, this is another reason why foreplay is important during sexual intercourse, because it allows it to kind of relax and stretch out a little bit. Stratified squamous epithelium is the lining. And again, if you think about sexual intercourse, there's a lot of abrasion during sexual intercourse. So having stratified squamous, multiple layers of cells, is protective. It also can contribute to the lubrication during intercourse. So the vagina itself connects the cervix of the uterus to the vestibule, which is the entrance. It is folded and has rugae, kind of like the lining of the stomach. You can kind of see those wrinkles here. And the hymen covers the vestibular opening of the vagina and can be perforated or not. It can be lost without intercourse as well. The hymen you probably know better as the virginal cherry, I guess. In reality, some women don't really have much of one, so it being ruptured during, horseplay or cheerleading or gymnastics or something like that isn't unheard of. It's not necessarily that they've had sexual intercourse, it's just that it ruptured. While other women, it's a completely solid membrane, and when they start having their period, they start having issues, and they actually have to get it surgically opened so that their menstrual cycle can actually leave their body, because without that, they have problems. But as far as you're pure until you have intercourse, and if it's ruptured, that means you're impure. Yeah, no, it doesn't work that way. Especially now when we have women who are as active as they are. If I were, some Victorian woman who never left her bedroom and embroidered next to a fireplace, maybe. But nowadays, women do just as much as anybody else. So there's no guarantee that will be intact later. The external genitalia, again, we've got kind of the collective name, which is the vulva or the pudendum. The vestibule is the space in which the vagina opens posteriorly and the urethra opens anteriorly. So the urethra is going... Yep. Let's try that again. The urethra is going to be here, okay? And then the vaginal canal is going to be back here. That space that exists is the vestibule. It's the entrance. You've got the labia. Labia literally translated is lips. So you have the labia minora, which are here, which you can follow those pointers. They're thin longitudinal skin folds that actually form a border on each side of that vestibule. The prepuce is actually going to be where the two lips of the labia minora unite to cover the clitoris. Here's the clitoris. Here are those lips that are lining, and they basically form a hood around that clitoris there. The labia majora, those are these, these right here. You can see that they're bigger and they're covered in skin instead of kind of a mucous membrane, kind of same as the lining of your cheek membrane. There are two prominent rounded folds of skin that are lateral to the labia minora. There is subcutaneous fat there, and it's responsible for their prominence. They're supposed to stick out more because it helps when you close your legs to actually seal that entrance. The two lateral ends join anteriorly to make the mons pubis as well. The pudendal cleft is going to be the space between the two labia majora. But I'll be honest, most of the time it doesn't exist unless you're standing with your legs wide open. When you close your legs, it seals this up. These two things seal in these two directions. And it's a safety thing. I mean, if you've got an entrance into your body, isn't it safer to keep that closed so that things don't just have ready access? The clitoris itself up here, it's the anterior margin of the vestibule. It consists of a shaft, a distal glans, and two erectile structures called the corpora cavernosa. It has a high number of sensory receptors that help to initiate and intensify levels of sexual tension. Just like the penis had all of those sensory receptors, the clitoris has numerous sensory receptors. And just like men have erectile tissue, believe it or not, so do women. So this clitoris here actually becomes erect during intercourse to allow it to come out of the hood for more sexual stimulation, because we do have all of those sensory receptors there. It expands at the base to form the crus of the clitoris, and the corpora cavernosa is basically equivalent to the male corpora cavernosa, and sexual stimulation results in engorgement, which makes the stimulation easier to accomplish. Basically, having it become erect and actually extend out means that it's easier to hit it to get the stimulation that you need. Now, the bulb of the vestibule, that's these kind of teardrop shaped things down in this bottom picture. They actually are equivalent to the corpus spongiosum in males. They become engorged as well with blood, and basically it means that it's more sensitive during sexual arousal. The expansion also causes the narrowing of the vaginal orifice and produces better contact of the vagina with the penis during intercourse. So you can see that the vaginal opening is right here. As these swell, it kind of makes that vaginal opening a little bit tighter, which means that you get better contact with the penis during intercourse. You do have 3 sets of glands, or I should say you do have 3 glands that exist. The periurethral gland, the greater vestibular gland, and the lesser vestibular gland. The paraurethral gland is located between the urethral tube, where you pee from, and the vaginal tube. So it's pretty much in that space right there, okay? And it creates mucus secretions. The greater vestibular glands is actually located between the hymen and the labia minora. So in that case, we're talking about like here in these areas. It produces a small quantity of mucus. It aids the cervical mucus and provides some lubrication. We think it's primarily lubrication, but if it has another function, we don't know. The lesser vestibular glands are basically going to be in the same area as the paraurethral glands, are going to be here. Again, it provides lubricant for sexual intercourse. The perineum is actually this connecting point here between where the vagina opens and the anus is. We call this the urogenital triangle. Anteriorly, the muscles that are connect up here to the symphysis pubis and then down here at the base of your pelvis. And then in the back, you also have a set of muscles that connect to the base of your hips here, or your coxal bones, and your symphysis pubis, your coxal bone in the back, your coccyx. Let me rewind that because that sounded terrible. Bottom of your pelvis here, where the ischium is, and then your coccyx back here. That makes the anal triangle. Now, the urogenital triangle has your urethra and your vaginal openings. The anal triangle has the anus. When you get an episiotomy, when you are having a baby, when they cut you, they're actually cutting. Let me see. They're actually cutting right here. Okay. Now, why do they do that? Well, if I cut you with a scalpel, it's going to be a clean cut and the edges are going to be a smooth edge that is easier to suture together. If, on the other hand, it tears, there's no guarantee that it's going to be that easy to suture together. Now, the mammary glands, these are modified sweat glands. They lie superficial, so on top of the pectoralis major muscles. They are present in both sexes, but normally they only function in females. So I say normally because there are exceptions. So what's the function? They are there to produce milk to nourish a newborn baby. That's one of the reasons why I said they're only important after reproduction has occurred. Because what is their function? Their function is to nourish a newborn baby. So the Cooper's ligament actually supports and holds the breast in place. As women get older, this ligament tends to kind of stretch and weaken, kind of like elastic in your chonis. So as women get older, their breasts start to sag because that ligament is getting weaker. The nipples are sensitive to tactile stimulation, to touch stimulation. They also contain smooth muscle cells that contract, causing the nipples to become erect in response to stimulation. So it does respond the same as erectile tissue during sexual stimulation. Now you might be saying, why? Well, think about a baby snuffling at a woman's breast because they're hungry. If that breast pops out, they have something to actually grab onto so that they can eat. So having it become erectile or having it be erectile doesn't really have anything to do with sexual stimulation as much as it does to feeding the baby.